When Malcolm Sterling placed his bid that crisp October morning, he never imagined the cascade of events he was setting into motion. The weathered structure stood silent against the autumn sky, its wooden frame sagging with decades of neglect. An auctioneer's voice rang out across the assembled crowd, but no competing offers emerged. The gathered townspeople seemed unusually subdued, their gazes fixed anywhere but on the property itself. Malcolm clutched $50 in worn bills, money he'd saved from months of odd jobs since arriving in the territory. After burying his wife Eleanor during the previous winter, he'd drifted westward seeking solace in unfamiliar surroundings. The prospect of owning property, even a dilapidated barn, represented a fresh start he desperately needed. The auctioneer's gavel descended with an unnaturally loud crack that seemed to reverberate longer than physics should allow. Several onlookers cast peculiar glances in Malcolm's direction, expressions mixing sympathy with something darker. An elderly woman actually crossed herself as he accepted the property deed. "Congratulations on your purchase," the auctioneer muttered, his enthusiasm notably absent. "May you find what you're looking for there." The cryptic statement puzzled Malcolm, but he attributed it to small-town eccentricity. He'd encountered plenty of superstitious behavior during his travels through frontier communities. Perhaps the structure had a reputation for harboring vermin or suffering from structural instability. Whatever the case, Malcolm welcomed the challenge of restoration work. Physical labor would provide distraction from the memories that haunted his thoughts. 3 weeks elapsed before Malcolm thoroughly examined his acquisition. The barn leaned eastward at an alarming angle, its foundation compromised by years of settling. Gaps in the roofing allowed shafts of sunlight to illuminate swirling dust particles. The project would consume months of effort, but Malcolm possessed both the skills and the motivation to see it through. He established a methodical approach, beginning with the foundation and working upward. The perimeter stones appeared sound despite their age, though several had shifted position over time. It was during this initial survey that Malcolm noticed irregularities in the flooring. Several boards rested unevenly, as though they'd been removed and hastily replaced without proper attention to alignment. Curiosity compelled him to investigate further. Using a crowbar from his toolkit, Malcolm pried loose one of the misaligned planks. It separated from its moorings with surprising ease, revealing not earth or stone, but empty space. His fingers encountered cold metal where he'd expected to find dirt. Malcolm expanded the opening methodically, removing additional boards until he could clearly observe what lay beneath. A metal door, considerably newer than anything else in the decrepit structure, was set directly into the foundation. Heavy iron construction and a substantial lock suggested this was no ordinary root cellar. Someone had invested considerable effort in concealing this entrance. The discovery triggered conflicting impulses. Malcolm's practical side urged caution. He'd come seeking peace, not complications. Yet intellectual curiosity proved stronger than prudence. He examined the locking mechanism and realized with growing unease that it wasn't actually secured. The hasp hung open, positioned to appear locked from casual observation. Someone had accessed this space recently. A sound from outside interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps approached with measured deliberation, their rhythm suggesting purpose rather than casual passage. Malcolm quickly replaced several boards, leaving only enough disturbance to mark the location. He grabbed a hammer and stood, feigning examination of the wall structure. A shadow fell across the doorway as a tall figure entered without invitation. The man appeared perhaps 60 years old, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, despite the rural setting. His eyes swept the interior with unmistakable familiarity before settling on Malcolm with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Sterling, I presume," the stranger said, his voice carrying practiced authority. "I'm Edmund Hartwell. I formerly served as magistrate in this jurisdiction before retiring. Word reached me about your property purchase. I felt obliged to welcome you personally to our community." His gaze lingered on the area where Malcolm had been working, and the younger man felt suddenly exposed despite having concealed the evidence of his discovery. "Much appreciated, Magistrate Hartwell," Malcolm replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Just beginning my assessment of necessary repairs." "Indeed. This structure has quite a history," Hartwell continued, moving closer with careful steps. "Built by a family that departed the territory under regrettable circumstances some years past. I trust you haven't encountered anything unusual during your inspection?" The question seemed casual, but Hartwell's expression remained intensely focused, watching for any revealing reaction. "Nothing beyond deterioration and rodent damage so far," Malcolm answered, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Though I imagine any abandoned building accumulates its share of hidden surprises." A thin smile crossed Hartwell's features, failing to reach his eyes. "Quite so. However, should you discover anything that strikes you as irregular, anything that might raise questions, I hope you'll bring it to my attention immediately. As a former legal authority, I maintain certain responsibilities toward community stability." The statement carried unmistakable undertones that raised Malcolm's apprehension considerably. After Hartwell departed, Malcolm stood alone in the gathering twilight, staring at the concealed entrance. The magistrate's visit felt far too coincidental, more like a warning disguised as courtesy. Whatever secrets lay behind that metal door, Malcolm understood he was no longer the only person aware of their existence. That realization placed him in considerable danger from someone who clearly preferred those secrets to remain buried. Sleep proved elusive that night. Malcolm lay in his rented quarters above the Mercantile, every sound amplified by anxiety. By dawn, he'd convinced himself that ignorance offered greater safety than knowledge. But upon returning to the barn, that resolve crumbled almost immediately. The metal door exerted an almost magnetic pull on his attention. Malcolm removed the concealing boards with trembling hands, his heartbeat accelerating. The unlocked hasp moved smoothly when he lifted it, and the heavy door swung open on well-maintained hinges that made no sound whatsoever. Someone had regularly serviced this entrance, keeping it functional despite its concealment. Malcolm struck a match and peered into the darkness below. Stone steps descended into a chamber carved from solid earth. The air rising from the opening carried scents of damp stone mixed with something else, something reminiscent of old courtrooms and formal proceedings. He lit his oil lantern and began his descent. The underground room extended far beyond what his light could immediately reveal. Fitted stone walls spoke of careful construction rather than hasty excavation. This was no simple storage space. Someone had invested significant resources in creating this hidden chamber. The first object to capture Malcolm's attention was a chair positioned prominently in the chamber's center. Massive and imposing, carved from dark wood, it faced a raised platform at the room's far end. Heavy iron rings had been bolted into the armrests, and dark stains marked the wood around them. Malcolm's stomach clenched as he realized these stains likely represented blood. This wasn't merely furniture. It was a device designed to restrain someone against their will. Behind the restraining chair stood wooden benches arranged in neat rows, capable of seating perhaps 20 individuals. They faced the platform where a simple table and larger chair created an unmistakable configuration. Malcolm had witnessed enough legal proceedings to recognize a courtroom arrangement immediately. Someone had constructed a tribunal beneath his barn, a place where formal proceedings could be conducted away from public scrutiny and oversight. But what kind of trials required such elaborate secrecy, such careful concealment? Malcolm approached the platform and found what he'd somehow anticipated discovering. Ledger books lay stacked on the table, their leather covers worn from repeated handling. He opened the topmost volume and felt his blood chill as he read page after page of meticulously documented entries. Names, dates, charges, and sentences filled every line in careful handwriting. But the crimes listed made absolutely no sense under any legitimate legal framework. Richard Patterson, charge, advocating for improved labor conditions. Sentence, permanent exile beyond territorial boundaries. The entry bore a date from 4 years prior. Malcolm recalled hearing about Richard Patterson, a man who'd vanished suddenly, leaving behind a pregnant wife who never learned his fate. Malcolm's hands shook as he turned additional pages, finding entry after entry documenting similar outcomes. Margaret Thornton, charged with encouraging worker dissent, sentenced to property forfeiture and expulsion. Malcolm knew Margaret's story, too. Her small farm had been sold for alleged unpaid taxes after her disappearance, though neighbors remembered her as someone who always settled her debts promptly. The pieces assembled themselves into a horrifying picture. These weren't legitimate legal proceedings. They were something far darker, a system designed to eliminate anyone who threatened certain interests. The chamber had witnessed years of such proceedings. each one justified by high-minded rhetoric about community welfare while serving far more sinister purposes. Footsteps overhead made Malcolm freeze. Someone was walking across the barn floor directly above his position, their pace measured and deliberate. He quickly closed the ledger and extinguished his lantern, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. The footsteps halted, and Malcolm heard floorboards creaking as someone moved deliberately around the space above. They knew precisely where to look. A voice called down through the boards, muffled but clearly audible. "Mr. Sterling, I know you're down there. Why don't you come up so we can have a proper conversation?" Malcolm recognized the speaker immediately. Edmund Hartwell had returned, and this time his tone carried no pretense of friendliness. Malcolm's mind raced as the implications crystallized. Hartwell wasn't merely aware of the secret tribunal, he was part of it, possibly its architect. The people listed in those ledgers hadn't simply disappeared. They'd been tried, convicted, and sentenced by a shadow court operating beyond any legitimate authority. And now Malcolm had stumbled into their domain, armed with knowledge that could destroy them all. The floorboards groaned as Hartwell positioned himself directly over the hidden entrance. "I'm offering you a choice, Mr. Sterling. Emerge from that chamber so we can discuss how a man of your practical nature might find profitable employment with our organization. Or remain stubborn and discover why so many others have occupied that restraining chair you've undoubtedly noticed." Malcolm clutched the ledger against his chest, his mind working frantically to identify some escape route. The chamber had only one entrance, and Hartwell controlled it completely. But perhaps this single book contained sufficient evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. If Malcolm could somehow survive long enough to present it to proper authorities. The question was whether any proper authorities existed, or if the corruption had infected every level of local power. Above him, Hartwell's patience finally exhausted itself. Malcolm heard the sound of boards being pried loose, and thin shafts of daylight began penetrating the chamber's darkness. The time for hiding had ended, continuing to reach 5,000 words. Part 5. The widow's gambit light flooded the chamber as Hartwell's silhouette appeared in the opening. The former magistrate descended the stone steps with movements suggesting long familiarity with this descent. 2 additional figures followed him, reinforcements whose presence confirmed this wasn't merely intimidation, but genuine threat. Malcolm backed toward the far wall, the ledger pressed against his chest like a shield. But before the confrontation could escalate, a 4th voice called down from above, a woman's voice, clear and unafraid. "Edmund Hartwell, I know you're down there with him." "This madness ends today," the magistrate's confident expression faltered. Malcolm watched genuine fear flicker across the older man's features as footsteps descended the stairs. A woman appeared carrying a lantern and a worn leather satchel. Malcolm recognized her from town, Beatrice Hayes, a widow who operated a small boarding house and generally kept to herself. But the way Hartwell and his companions reacted suggested there was far more to Beatrice Hayes than her quiet public persona revealed. The magistrate actually stepped backward, his earlier authority evaporating. "Beatrice, you shouldn't be here," Hartwell stammered, his voice losing its commanding tone. "This is a private matter that doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens in this chamber concerns me, Edmund," she replied with steel in her voice. "You made certain of that when you brought my husband down here 6 years ago." The revelation hit Malcolm like a physical blow. This woman had personal experience with the tribunal's methods. Daniel Hayes was given every opportunity to cooperate. One of Hartwell's companions interjected weakly. He chose to interfere with legitimate business operations. Beatrice opened her satchel and withdrew a thick folder. "I have copies of every document you thought you destroyed. Every record of every illegal proceeding conducted in this chamber. Daniel wasn't just my husband, he was a territorial marshal. He spent months gathering evidence of your activities before you silenced him." The words struck the room like lightning. This wasn't just another victim's widow. This was someone who'd been preparing for this confrontation for years. "The evidence in this folder has already been copied and distributed to federal authorities," Beatrice continued, her voice growing stronger. "Territorial marshals are riding here now, and they know exactly where to find this chamber. Your only choice is whether you want to be arrested down here like rats in a trap, or upstairs where you can maintain some dignity." The sound of horses approaching the barn above made everyone freeze. Hoofbeats circled the structure, followed by authoritative voices issuing commands. Federal authorities were arriving, and the secret tribunal was about to face judgment from a court far more legitimate than the one they'd created in darkness. Part 6. Justice delayed the U. Federal marshals' voices grew louder overhead as they secured the premises. Malcolm could hear systematic movement across the wooden floor, trained officers executing a coordinated operation. Edmund Hartwell's hand, which had been moving toward his coat pocket, froze mid-motion. The man who had dispensed his own version of justice for years now faced genuine legal authority. "You planned this perfectly, didn't you, Beatrice?" Hartwell said bitterly. 6 years of playing the grieving widow while gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to spring your trap. Beatrice's response was measured and calm, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. "Daniel taught me that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, Edmund. Sometimes it just means justice is being prepared properly. Every document you thought destroyed, every witness you thought silenced, every victim you thought forgotten, I remembered them all." Marshal Boots descended the stone stairs. 4 armed officers entered the chamber, moving with professional confidence. Their leader, a gray-haired man with stern features, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. "Marshal Thompson, Territorial District," he announced. "We have federal warrants for the arrest of Edmund Hartwell and his associates on charges of conspiracy, murder, and operating an illegal court system. Mrs. Hayes, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation." Malcolm realized he was witnessing the culmination of a federal investigation that had been building for months or possibly years. Beatrice Hayes hadn't been acting alone. She'd been working with territorial authorities who possessed the resources and authority to properly prosecute these crimes. As the marshals secured their prisoners with iron shackles, Thompson turned to Malcolm. "Mr. Sterling, we'll need your testimony about discovering this chamber and the evidence you found here. Your timing, though accidental, proved crucial to our operation." Malcolm looked around the chamber that had witnessed so much suffering and injustice. The stone walls were finally giving up their secrets. He wondered how many other communities harbored similar conspiracies. How many other secret tribunals operated beyond legitimate authorities' reach? This victory was significant, but Malcolm suspected it represented only one battle in a much larger war between justice and corruption. Part 7. Rebuilding and Redemption. 3 months later, Malcolm stood in the territorial courthouse listening to the federal judge read final verdicts in what newspapers had termed the most significant corruption case in the territory's history. Edmund Hartwell received 25 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators received proportionally lighter sentences, but all would spend considerable time behind bars. The courtroom overflowed with victims' families, journalists from newspapers across the territory, and curious citizens who'd followed the trial through months of shocking testimony. Malcolm had testified about his discovery and the evidence he'd found, becoming an unwilling celebrity whose story had been reported in distant publications. Outside the courthouse, Beatrice Hayes approached with a letter bearing the territorial governor's seal. "This came for you," she said, handing him the official document. "It's the deed to the barn property, transferred to you with no payment required. The governor believes the man who exposed this conspiracy deserves to decide what happens to the land." Malcolm read the letter with trembling hands. The territorial government considered his actions a significant service to the community. Ownership was being transferred to him as recognition of his courage and civic duty. He could keep the land, sell it, or donate it for public use. The choice was entirely his. "There's something else." Beatrice continued, producing a second document. 23 families who lost relatives to Hartwell's tribunal have filed a petition asking that the property be converted into a memorial. They want the chamber preserved as a reminder of what happens when communities allow justice to be perverted by powerful interests. The petition carried names Malcolm recognized from the ledger, families who'd waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. They'd finally learned the truth during the trial, and now they wanted to ensure their relatives' suffering wouldn't be forgotten. Marshal Thompson, who'd remained in town throughout the trial, found Malcolm at his boarding house the following day. "The territorial government has offered you a position as a deputy marshal, if you're interested. Your experience with this case and your eye for detail could prove valuable in investigating other communities where similar corruption might exist." Malcolm considered the offer carefully. The work would be dangerous and require traveling throughout the territory. but it would allow him to help ensure no other community suffered under the kind of shadow justice system that had operated here. His carpentry skills and ability to examine structures might prove useful in uncovering other hidden chambers and secret operations. Beatrice appeared the next morning with a comprehensive proposal. She'd been meeting with victim families, territorial officials, and community leaders to develop a plan that would transform the site from a place of darkness into something serving the public good. "We want to build a courthouse," she explained, spreading architectural drawings across the table. "A proper territorial courthouse where legal proceedings can be conducted in full public view, with protections for the accused and accountability for judges. The hidden chamber would be preserved beneath it as a museum, a reminder of what happens when justice is conducted in secret." Malcolm studied the drawings with growing enthusiasm. The proposed building would be substantial but not ostentatious, designed to inspire confidence in legitimate legal proceedings. Most importantly, it would ensure that the site where so much injustice occurred would become a place where proper justice could be administered. The plan had already received approval from the territorial governor and funding commitments from the federal government. Construction could begin as soon as Malcolm signed the transfer documents. 1 year after the trials ended, Malcolm stood in the completed territorial courthouse watching the first official legal proceeding conducted in the new building. Judge Patricia Morrison, appointed specifically for her reputation for fairness and transparency, presided over a simple property dispute with meticulous attention to legal procedure. The public gallery was full of citizens who'd come to witness justice being administered in daylight rather than darkness. Every aspect of the proceedings was open to public scrutiny, with detailed records being maintained and legal representation provided for both parties. Malcolm had accepted Marshall Thompson's offer and spent the past year traveling throughout the territory, investigating reports of corruption and illegal activities. His work had uncovered 2 additional cases of local officials exceeding their authority, though neither approached the systematic conspiracy that had operated beneath his barn. Beatrice Hayes had been appointed as the courthouse's first clerk, ensuring proper legal procedures were followed and records maintained according to territorial standards. She'd also established a small museum in the preserved chamber beneath the building, where visitors could learn about the illegal tribunal and the importance of protecting legal rights. After the court session ended, Malcolm walked down to the basement museum where a bronze plaque listed the names of all 47 people who'd been tried by Hartwell's illegal tribunal. 23 had been murdered outright, while others had been driven from the territory after property confiscation. During the federal investigation, authorities had located 9 survivors living under assumed names in other territories, too frightened to return until learning their persecutors had been imprisoned. As Malcolm prepared to leave for his next assignment, a mining community where federal authorities suspected officials were selling claims illegally, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning when he'd pried up loose floorboards in search of a peaceful new beginning. The discovery that had initially threatened to destroy him had instead given his life a sense of purpose he'd never expected to find. The barn that once hidden terrible secrets had become the foundation for something protecting the rights of countless future generations. The legacy of those who suffered in the hidden chamber would live on, not in darkness and fear, but in the bright light of legitimate justice administered with full public oversight and protection for all.